The abandoned church stood at the edge of town like a shadow that refused to fade. Its spire, jagged and crumbling, clawed at the sky, while ivy and weeds crept along the stone walls, claiming the building as though it had been waiting for them for decades. The wind whispered through broken stained-glass windows, carrying the faint, almost imperceptible echo of hymns long silenced. No one entered this place willingly, yet something about it drew the curious, the daring, and the foolish. Paranormal investigators often spoke of it in hushed tones, citing stories of fleeting shapes, unexplained noises, and a presence that refused to rest. The locals avoided it entirely, crossing the street or turning down side lanes to escape its looming silhouette. The investigator arrived just as twilight bled into darkness, the sky streaked with bruised purple and orange. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, thick and heavy, pressing against him like an invisible hand. He pushed open the rusted gate and stepped onto the overgrown path, each footfall crunching against gravel and fallen leaves. The wind carried with it a faint scent of incense and decay, a combination that made his stomach twist in uneasy recognition. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as he pushed them open, revealing the nave swallowed in shadows. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the weak beam of his torch, drifting in tiny clouds that seemed to move of their own accord. The pews, rotting and splintered, leaned at odd angles, and the altar, though draped in grime, held a presence that demanded reverence or fear. He stepped carefully, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. Every sound seemed amplified, echoing off the stone walls, bouncing back in uneven, unsettling ways. He paused at the center of the nave, torch sweeping across the shadows, and felt it immediately. A weight in the air, as though the church itself was aware of his presence. The investigator set up his equipment meticulously. Cameras, audio recorders, EMF detectors, tools designed to capture the unseen. But here, even the technology felt insignificant, inadequate against the living darkness that lingered among the shadows. His journal later recorded the sensation as if the building was breathing around him, inhaling and exhaling with patience, waiting for him to notice. A low hum filled the space, subtle at first, vibrating through the stone walls and settling in his chest. It was not a sound one could locate, yet it pressed insistently against his senses. The air grew colder, and the torch flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to slither along the walls. He told himself it was merely the failing light and the drafts of a derelict building, yet every instinct screamed otherwise. As he moved closer to the altar, the hum intensified. The silence of decades seemed to fracture, replaced by faint whispers that licked the edges of his consciousness. He strained to hear words, but they dissolved the moment he tried to focus. Shadows shifted in his peripheral vision, forming shapes that resisted comprehension. Faces pressed against stone and wood, fleeting glimpses of eyes that vanished when met directly. He paused, heart hammering, torch beam trembling. The EMF detector began to spike, its light flickering in rapid pulses. The air thickened, and a sudden chill swept through the nave, carrying the unmistakable scent of candle smoke, though no flame burned. He recorded every detail, knowing that what he was experiencing could never be fully explained. In that moment, standing at the center of a church that time had abandoned, he felt it clearly. The building was alive, a vessel of old sorrow and relentless watchfulness. Every shadow, every whisper, every faint movement hinted at stories untold, tragedies unrecorded, and a presence that would not forgive intrusion. And then, from somewhere high above, a single note struck, a clear, piercing sound of a bell, though the belfry door was long gone and the rope severed decades ago. The note reverberated through the nave, lingering far too long, a signal that someone or something had acknowledged his presence. He froze, torch shaking, breath caught in his throat, as the shadows deepened and the church seemed to inhale, waiting for his next move. The silence of the abandoned church pressed upon him like a living thing, thick and heavy, each breath seeming to echo unnaturally against the cold stone walls. The faint note of the unseen bell still lingered in his ears, a haunting reminder that he was not alone. His torchlight trembled as he swept it across the nave, the beam catching the rotting pews and cracked statues, throwing grotesque shadows that writhed and shifted with every flicker. Then he heard it, a footstep. Soft, deliberate, measured. Not a creak from the worn floorboards, not the settling groan of the old building, but a distinct, human-like step echoing behind him. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as though the shadows themselves had bristled. He turned slowly, sweeping the torch in a wide arc, but the nave appeared empty. Only the stillness, thick with dust and age, greeted him. He took another step forward, and the sound followed. Step, pause, step, pause, matching his own movements. His heart pounded so fiercely, he was certain it could be heard over the whispering wind that seemed trapped inside the church. Every rational explanation fled his mind. There was no one else here, yet the footsteps continued, echoing and then fading, only to return moments later in a rhythm that mocked his fear. The air grew colder, the chill creeping under his clothes, curling around his spine like icy fingers. His EMF detector flickered violently, lights strobing in a chaotic rhythm. The whispers returned, this time closer, brushing at the edges of his ears, impossible to locate, yet undeniably real. Words seemed to form and vanish, fragments of prayers long silenced, sighs of the forgotten, murmured beneath his consciousness. He moved toward the altar, each step deliberate, every footfall met with the same echoing response. Shadows clung to the corners, lengthening unnaturally, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to watch him. The wooden pews groaned under invisible weight, and the floorboards creaked in spots he had already crossed, as though the church were replaying memories of someone, or something, moving within its walls. The torchlight caught a figure at the far end of the nave, just beyond the altar. Pale, indistinct, shifting with the darkness, it vanished the moment he blinked. A chill ran through him, and the EMF detector's strobing became almost frantic. The footsteps now circled him, approaching, retreating, merging with the groans of the old building. He could feel the eyes on him, pressed from every shadowed corner, waiting, patient, and unyielding. His journal later recorded the moment. The steps follow, yet there is no one there. The church breathes around me. It knows I am here. It waits. Every shadow, every groan, every whisper is a part of it. I am intruding upon something that refuses to be disturbed. He tried to speak, calling out, but his voice dissolved into the cold air, swallowed immediately. The footsteps stopped, leaving only the faintest echo behind, a reminder that the church's presence was not bound by space or reason. It existed, patient and aware, observing his intrusion, deciding how far it would allow him to go. A sudden rush of wind swept down the nave, extinguishing a candle that had inexplicably flickered to life on the altar. The shadows deepened, folding over themselves, and the air carried a low, guttural murmur. He could not tell if it was the building speaking or something inhabiting it, but the message was clear. The church knew him. It had always known him. The footsteps returned, this time in unison, marching toward the entrance, yet he felt drawn toward the altar, compelled. The whispers crescendoed, forming a symphony of voices that seemed to pour from the walls themselves, filling the nave with tales of sorrow, anguish, and relentless waiting. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow detaching from the wall, gliding silently along the stone floor, stopping just beyond his reach. The footsteps echoed again, aligned perfectly with the shadow's glide. Something was close now, circling him, watching, testing his resolve. He realized in that instant that the church had always been alive, every footstep, every whisper, every shadow a part of it, and it had chosen him as its latest witness. The nave stretched ahead, a labyrinth of decayed wood and shattered glass, yet it felt impossibly larger than it should. Shadows pooled in the corners, blacker than darkness itself, shifting subtly as if aware of his every movement. His torch swept across the aisle, illuminating fragments of torn hymnals, splintered pews, and broken statues. But the shadows seemed to absorb the light, crawling along the walls and floor like living ink. From somewhere deep behind him came a soft shuffle, barely audible, yet distinct enough to make his chest tighten. He spun the torch toward the source, but the pews appeared empty. Still, something moved, an impression of form, long and thin, flickering at the edge of vision, retreating when looked at directly. Each flicker sent a cold tingle down his spine, and he knew instinctively that he was being watched, not by human eyes, but by something far older, patient, and intent. The whispers returned, threading through the nave in a chorus of overlapping tones. They were fragmented prayers, half-forgotten psalms, sighs of despair from centuries past. They rose and fell with an impossible rhythm, circling around him as if the building itself were breathing him in and out. His boots creaked over the warped floorboards, yet behind him, another sound mirrored his steps, exactly, soft, deliberate, matching his pace. He moved cautiously along the aisle, passing the shattered pews, each one seeming to reach out in shadow, stretching unnaturally toward his legs. Shapes moved behind the wooden benches, twisting with the angles of light and shadow, fleeting glimpses of pale faces with hollow eyes, mouths frozen in silent screams. The air was thick with the scent of candle wax, decay, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. A sudden flicker caught his attention at the far end of the nave. A shadow seemed to detach itself from the back wall, sliding along the floor in a motion that was neither human nor entirely weightless. The torch trembled in his hands, illuminating the space for brief, terrifying seconds. The figure hovered near the altar, just beyond reach, vanishing whenever he moved closer, as though it existed only to tease, to watch, to lure him deeper into the church's heart. The EMF detector beeped sharply, red lights strobing in chaotic bursts. He felt the hairs on his arms rise as an invisible weight pressed down on his shoulders. The journal he kept recorded the sensation. The shadows are not simple tricks of light. They move with intent. They watch, follow, anticipate. The church is alive in a way that is beyond understanding, and I am trespassing. Another sound joined the whispers, a soft scraping, like fingernails along stone, echoing from behind the pews. He froze, torch sweeping nervously from side to side. In the corner of the nave, he glimpsed a figure crouched low, long limbs bent unnaturally, head tilting in impossible angles. Its eyes glimmered faintly in the torchlight, fixed directly on him. He blinked, and it vanished, leaving only the scraping echo and the sense of presence, patient and unyielding. The shadows thickened, pooling around the pews, merging into a single writhing mass that seemed almost alive. A gust of cold air blew down the aisle, extinguishing a candle that had inexplicably lit itself, and the whispers rose in intensity, urgent and commanding, threading into the corners of his mind. Do not leave. Watch. Witness. Stay. Every instinct screamed to run, yet some invisible force pulled him forward, toward the altar, toward the unseen heart of the church. The shadows moved in tandem, shifting with every step, sometimes retreating, sometimes advancing, always keeping pace, always watching. And then, from behind one of the pews, a single hand emerged, pale and elongated, fingers curling like claws, reaching out just beyond the torch's beam. It hovered for a heartbeat, then retreated, leaving only the lingering cold, the whispers, and the overwhelming certainty that the church was alive, and it had noticed him. The nave stretched on, silent except for the faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to rise from the stone floor itself. He advanced cautiously, torch in hand, the beams slicing through the darkness, illuminating fragments of the church that seemed to shift with every step. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew, wax, and something indefinably old, like memory itself had soaked into the walls. Then it began. A sound at first so faint he could have imagined it. A delicate, eerie chorus, whispering in harmony. Not the echo of his own footfalls, nor the creak of the rotting pews, but voices. Soft, female, male, children perhaps, layered together in melodies that should not exist in a place abandoned for decades. The song was incomplete, fragmented, yet filled with a sorrow and longing that pressed against his chest like a weight. He froze, heart pounding, as the voices grew louder, weaving around him from every corner of the nave. The air vibrated with unseen energy, the whispers coalescing into harmonies that were both beautiful and horrifying. They came from the choir stalls, though nothing occupied them. No bodies, no shadows, just empty with splintered and worn with age. Yet the singing persisted, a phantom choir that moved him to fear as much as awe. He advanced slowly, torch sweeping across the stalls. The floor beneath him creaked unnaturally, though he had stepped here before. Shadows twisted in impossible ways, lengthening and retreating, merging with the darkness of the nave. Faces flashed briefly in the flickering light, pale, hollow-eyed, mouths open as if in midsong. He blinked, and they were gone, leaving only silence and the heavy echo of the choir that sang alone. A gust of cold air swept down from the vaulted ceiling, extinguishing a candle that had inexplicably ignited near the altar. The hum of the singing intensified, threading through the air like a living thing, curling into his ears, pressing against his skull. His EMF detector surged with frantic beeps, lights strobing wildly. The whispers merged with the harmonies, forming words that slithered just beyond comprehension. Half-remembered prayers and desperate pleas from long ago. Do not leave. Witness. Stay. He moved closer to the stalls, compelled, though his every instinct urged retreat. The shadows between the pews thickened, shifting with intent. Pale hands pressed against the edges of the wood, fingers curling over splintered surfaces, then retracting just beyond the torch's beam. Figures appeared in the corners, indistinct, bending impossibly, heads tilting unnaturally as they joined the invisible choir. The sensation was overwhelming. Every sense screamed the church was alive, breathing around him, aware of him. The notes of the phantom choir trembled in the air, vibrating the stone beneath his feet. He felt as if he were standing at the center of a gathering storm, a nexus where the living and the spectral converged. A shadow detached itself from the choir stalls, gliding silently toward him. Limbs elongated unnaturally, bending with impossible angles, head tilted as though assessing, judging, deciding his fate. The choir rose in crescendo, voices layered and unearthly, as if the entire building had joined in. Every note, every whisper, pressed against his mind, insisting, commanding, stay, do not turn away, witness the forgotten. He shivered, unable to resist the pull toward the altar, toward the heart of the song. The shadows closed in slowly, deliberately, the invisible choir accompanying their movement with a haunting harmony. He felt their eyes upon him from every corner, pressed from behind the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. Then the singing stopped abruptly. Silence fell like a physical weight, pressing down on him, leaving only the tremor of air and the faint rustle of shadows. In that silence, he knew he was not alone. Something had acknowledged him, something ancient and patient, and it was waiting. The altar loomed ahead, draped in dust and decay, a remnant of ceremonies long forgotten. He approached cautiously, every step echoing against the cold stone walls, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the building itself exhaled around him, suffocating and heavy. Shadows pooled along the edges of the altar, stretching like living tendrils, shifting subtly with every tremble of his torchlight. It was then he heard them. Whispers, faint at first, curling through the nave like smoke, rising from beneath the altar itself. Low, urgent, half-formed, impossible to locate. The words teased comprehension, slipping away whenever he tried to focus. The whispers carried a tone of pleading, of sorrow, of warning, pressing against his mind, and in that moment, he felt as though the very stones beneath him were alive, murmuring secrets long buried. He crouched, torch beams sweeping across the floor, and noticed a faint crack at the base of the altar. Dust-covered stones had shifted slightly, forming a narrow gap just wide enough to suggest a hollow beneath. The whispers seemed to grow stronger here, insistent, almost intelligible. He leaned closer, heart hammering. As the air thickened and the temperature dropped further, a bone-deep chill curling through his chest. Reaching toward the crack, his fingers brushed against the cold stone. The whispers surged, overlapping, chaotic yet deliberate, like a chorus of voices trapped between worlds. He heard fragments. "Do not disturb. They are waiting. Never leave." His pulse thundered in his ears as the shadows along the walls stretched toward him, creeping slowly across the floor, drawn to the altar's secret. He found a loose stone, prying it carefully with trembling hands. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity, its interior blackened with age. From the darkness came a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost inaudible, like fingernails brushing against wood. The EMF detector spiked violently, its lights flickering erratically as though responding to some unseen force. He recoiled slightly, but curiosity or compulsion drove him onward. He lowered the torch, peering into the cavity. At first, nothing was visible, only the black emptiness of the hollow. Then, a faint glimmer reflected back. A metallic glint, a small object partially buried in dust and grime. He reached in, trembling, and pulled out a tarnished locket. The whispers swelled immediately, frantic now, imploring, warning, yet forming no coherent words. His fingers closed around the cold metal, and for a fleeting instant, he felt a presence brush past him, close enough to chill him to the bone. The locket clicked open under his fingers, revealing a tiny photograph, blurred and faded with time. He could barely make out the features, yet the image seemed to shift in the torchlight, as though the eyes within it were alive, staring back at him. The whispers grew louder, sharper, circling his mind in spirals, and he realized with horror that the voices were coming not from the altar, but from the locket itself. A movement in the shadows made him spin, torch slicing the air, but the nave remained empty. Only the altar, only the cavity, only the locket pulsing faintly with some unnatural life. The whispers now carried urgency, a fragmented command. "Return to Barry. Do not look, do not take." The air grew thick with tension, the shadows leaning closer, stretching across the floor toward him. His breath came in shallow gasps, heart hammering, as he struggled to comprehend the sensation that the church itself was aware of the object in his hand and of him, and that both were inexorably tied to its dark intent. He closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket, hoping to contain whatever restless force it held. But as he straightened, the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling word that resonated through the nave, through the shadows, through his very bones. "Stay." The torch flickered violently, the shadows shivering and coiling like living smoke, and he realized the church had already begun to decide what to do with him. The investigator stepped back from the altar, locket heavy in his pocket, and felt the oppressive weight of the church pressing closer. The air was damp and cold, each inhalation carrying the acrid scent of burnt wax and decayed wood. Shadows stretched and contracted across the walls and floor, moving independently of the torchlight, pooling in corners and beneath the shattered pews. The whispers continued, fragmented yet persistent, curling around his mind like icy fingers. Ahead, on a small raised platform near the altar, dozens of candles had inexplicably ignited. They flickered without wind, their flames quivering in perfect unison, casting dancing shadows that writhed across the walls. The shadows elongated, twisted, and sometimes coalesced into shapes that were almost human, but wrong. Distorted limbs, elongated necks, faces frozen in silent screams. The candles' glow revealed nothing beyond their immediate circle, leaving the rest of the nave steeped in impenetrable darkness. He moved cautiously toward the flickering light. Each step echoed unnaturally against the stone floor, and with each echo, a shadow detached itself from the far corners, sliding silently toward him. They were countless now, long, thin forms, bending and twisting as they advanced. The whispers intensified, overlapping in a chorus of broken words. "Watch, do not leave, stay, forever." One of the candles flared suddenly, bright as lightning, illuminating a figure kneeling at the altar. Pale, indistinct, features obscured, yet its presence was undeniable. The figure did not move, yet he felt its gaze pierce through him, the oppressive force of its attention almost suffocating. The EMF detector went wild, strobing in erratic bursts, and the faint hum in the stone floor rose into a vibration that seemed to resonate inside his chest. He extended a hand toward the nearest candle, and the flame danced violently, flaring higher as if protesting. The shadows around him surged, curling in a wave that almost knocked him to the ground. A whisper, closer this time, breathed directly into his ear. "You should not be here." The candle's light began to flicker in patterns, forming elongated, jagged symbols that stretched across the floor. They pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, in time with his own racing pulse. Shadows coiled around the altar, converging toward the kneeling figure. It slowly raised its head, revealing empty sockets where eyes should have been. Yet he felt its gaze, heavy and unyielding. He stumbled back, torch shaking, but the shadows followed, gliding silently over the floor, around the pews, creeping toward him with purpose. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the voices overlapping into a single, commanding tone that echoed through every corner of the church. "Join us, forever, stay." Desperate, he turned to flee, only to find the doors at the far end of the nave sealed with shadows. They writhed like living things, blocking any escape. The candle's flames flickered violently in unison, illuminating hundreds of pale, distorted hands reaching from the floor, from the walls, from the very shadows themselves. They were waiting, patient, insistent, as though the church itself had extended its grasp into every crevice. He fell to his knees, heart hammering, breath ragged, realizing fully that the building was alive in a way he could not understand. The candles flickered and the shadows lunged closer, the whispers now forming words that clawed directly at his mind. "You cannot leave, you belong, you will witness forever." And in that moment, standing amidst the flickering flames, surrounded by living shadows, he understood that the church was not merely haunted. It was sentient, it was aware, and it had claimed him as its newest observer, unable or unwilling to let him go. The investigator's pulse thundered in his chest as he retraced his steps toward the church's belfry, an upper platform long forgotten and partially collapsed. The staircase leading up was narrow, wooden, and warped, groaning ominously under each careful footfall. Shadows clung to the walls like dark vines, twisting and writhing as he ascended, and the whispers followed him, urgent and layered, brushing the edges of his consciousness with every step. At the top, the belfry was choked with decay. Broken beams jutted in odd angles, dust thick enough to make the air heavy. The faint moonlight streamed through the shattered slats, illuminating cobwebs that hung like veils across the floor. He swept the torch across the space and froze. There, partially hidden behind a fallen beam, was a doorway, narrow, unremarkable, yet perfectly intact. Its hinges were old but functional, its handle coated in rust. The whispers intensified as he approached. They carried the tone of warning this time, not mere observation, threading through the air like icy fingers. "Do not enter, do not disturb, some things should remain unseen." His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, and yet curiosity, or perhaps inevitability, compelled him to push the door open. Inside was a small, hidden chamber. Dust coated the floor and walls, yet the air felt different, denser, charged, as if the space itself pulsed with intent. The torchlight revealed a collection of objects scattered across a table. Old manuscripts, tarnished chalices, and small wooden figures carved with grotesque precision. The room smelled of mold and something faintly metallic, the scent curling into his nostrils and clawing at his stomach. He moved cautiously among the objects, examining the manuscripts. They were filled with indecipherable symbols, prayers that had been struck through, diagrams of human figures entwined with shadows, and annotations in a hand so hurried and frantic it trembled across the page. He could feel the energy in the room, subtle at first, then rising, pressing against him like an invisible hand, urging him to leave, or perhaps warning him of what lay ahead. From somewhere deep within the church, a bell chimed softly, though the belfry's rope had been severed decades ago. The sound resonated in the chamber, reverberating through the floorboards and walls, stirring shadows in the corners. Pale forms pressed against the walls, elongated and distorted, some crouching low, others reaching high, their blank faces turned toward him as if studying, judging. His torch flickered violently as he approached the far corner, revealing a small trapdoor set into the floor, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. The whispers swelled, overlapping, urgent, chaotic. This is the heart. This is where they wait. Do not awaken them. Yet, instinct compelled him. He pried open the trapdoor. A darkness deeper than the shadows of the room itself yawned before him. A void that exhaled cold air and carried a faint, echoing pulse, like a heartbeat from beneath the church. He hesitated, knowing that whatever lay beyond was ancient, patient, and aware of his intrusion. The EMF detector flared violently, readings spiking beyond measure, and a low hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor, walls, and even the very air around him. Shadows surged toward the trapdoor, pressing close, their movements deliberate, as though they were guardians of something long hidden. Torch shaking, he glimpsed movement within the void. A faint shimmer, a form that seemed to writhe and shift, too fluid to be human, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. The whispers formed a single, coherent word, carried not through sound but directly into his mind. Descend. And yet, despite the dread pooling in his chest, a part of him felt compelled to obey, to step into the unknown and witness whatever lay hidden beneath the church's floors. The investigator descended carefully into the hidden chamber beneath the belfry, each step echoing faintly against stone walls that seemed impossibly thick, as though the building itself were breathing around him. The air grew colder with every footfall, carrying the metallic tang of rust and the faint, unmistakable scent of something more sinister, something ancient and lingering. Shadows clung to the edges of his torchlight, pooling along corners and recesses, stretching unnaturally as though watching his every move. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, smaller than the one above, yet far older, carved with intricate, unsettling symbols that seemed almost to writhe under the torch's beam. A crucifix rested upon it, simple at first glance, yet closer inspection revealed that the wood was darkened with age and something else. Stains that glimmered faintly in the flickering light, like moisture that should not be there. He approached, heart hammering, and noticed the crucifix weeping. Tiny droplets formed along the figure's face, dripping slowly onto the altar below. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated with an unnatural intensity, echoing through the chamber and pressing directly against his mind. The air vibrated with a low hum, a chorus of whispers threading through the stone, rising and falling in rhythm with the drops of liquid that fell relentlessly. The EMF detector flared, lights strobing in frantic bursts. Shadows shifted violently along the walls, forming shapes that bent and twisted impossibly, reaching toward him, stretching across the floor, pressing from the corners. He stepped closer, compelled despite the chill pooling in his stomach, and the whispers coalesced into faint words, unintelligible yet urgent. Witness, do not leave, they are watching. His torch illuminated the altar fully, revealing carvings of figures beneath the crucifix, human in form yet grotesquely elongated, faces twisted in silent screams, arms stretched toward the crucifix as though begging for salvation that never came. The weeping intensified, the drops falling faster, and he realized with a shiver that the liquid was not water. It smelled faintly of iron, of old blood, and carried with it a sensation of sorrow so deep it pressed on his chest, making each breath a struggle. From the far corner of the chamber, a shadow detached itself from the wall, sliding silently across the stone floor. Limbs bent unnaturally, angles impossible, head tilted as it advanced toward him. The whispers rose in urgency, swirling around his mind like a storm. Do not touch, do not disturb, stay. He reached out, compelled, toward the crucifix. The moment his fingers brushed the cold, weeping wood, the chamber seemed to shudder. Shadows lunged and recoiled. The whispers exploded into a cacophony of sound, and the liquid on the crucifix's face surged, dripping faster, pooling on the altar, spreading across the floor in dark rivulets. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the chamber itself were alive, inhaling him, weighing him down, insisting he remain. He stepped back, heart racing, realizing fully that this was not a simple relic or haunted object. The crucifix was a focal point, a vessel for something ancient, patient, and deliberate. It had waited for witnesses, for intruders, for those who would be drawn into its sphere of influence. Every shadow, every whisper, every drop of the unholy liquid seemed orchestrated to compel him to understand that he was already entangled, and escape might no longer be possible. A final, violent gust of cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing his torch and plunging him into darkness. The whispers persisted, coiling tightly around his mind. "You see now you cannot leave, you belong." And in the blackness, he felt the weeping crucifix in the corner of his vision, its sorrow and intent pressing directly upon him. A silent promise that the church would claim him as it had claimed countless others. Darkness enveloped the chamber, broken only by the faint red glow of the EMF detector. The investigator's hands shook as he fumbled with his equipment, desperate to capture evidence, to record what he could barely comprehend. The air was thick, suffocating, vibrating with whispers that seemed to crawl along the walls, across the floor, threading into his mind like invisible tendrils. He switched on the audio recorder, its small red light blinking steadily. Immediately, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into words just beyond comprehension, an unintelligible language that pressed insistently against his consciousness. The crucifix still wept, its dark liquid dripping onto the altar, each drop echoing like a heartbeat through the stone chamber. Shadows shifted in time with the drips, forming shapes that bent and contorted unnaturally, crawling along walls, floor, and ceiling as if the church itself were alive and aware of every movement. His torch flickered violently, illuminating a corner where a shadow detached itself from the wall, gliding toward him without sound. Limbs bent at impossible angles, and pale, hollow faces seemed to peer from every crevice, watching, waiting. The whispers overlapped, forming a chorus of frantic, urgent voices. "Do not leave, stay witness, forever." He began to speak into the recorder, voice trembling. Every word felt inadequate, unable to convey the oppressive awareness of the space, the sentience of the shadows, the unrelenting sorrow emanating from the crucifix. Every sound in the chamber was amplified, the soft drip of the liquid, the scraping of unseen movement, the low, vibrating hum that seemed to originate from the stone itself. Suddenly, the shadows surged, coiling around the altar and rising from the floor like smoke given form. The recorder beeped erratically, unable to keep pace with the energy. Yet it continued, capturing the cacophony of whispers, the creaking of the ancient wood, the low moans that seemed to vibrate from within the walls. The investigator's breathing became ragged, shallow, as a sense of inevitability pressed down on him. He realized he was not merely documenting events. He was part of them. The church had noticed him long before his arrival, and now it had orchestrated his experience, testing him, luring him deeper into the shadows. Every flicker of torchlight, every movement of air, every whisper and creaking board was deliberate, guiding him toward a truth he could barely grasp. He fumbled with the recorder again, trying to stop it, but it seemed fused to the air, to the shadows, to the chamber itself. The whispers rose to a crescendo, urgent, commanding, overlapping until he could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from the cacophony. "Stay, you cannot leave, you belong, witness forever." And then the crucifix wept faster, the liquid splashing across the altar and pooling on the floor, spreading into the shadows. The investigator stepped back, tripping over a loose floorboard, and in that instant, a wave of darkness surged from the corners, enveloping him completely. His torch went out, leaving him with only the recorder and the suffocating presence of the church, alive and intent. The last thing the recording captured was his own voice, trembling, barely audible over the whispers. "It's alive, everything watching, please." The sound ended abruptly, replaced by static, then silence. The church exhaled. Shadows pressed tighter, curling around every surface, waiting. Outside, the building remained silent, imposing, empty to anyone who dared glance inside. The investigator was gone. Only the recorder remained, a faint, blinking light capturing the final moments of a man consumed by a building that had always been more than stone and wood. The church was silent now, but the silence was deceptive, heavy with anticipation, thick as the dust that coated every surface. The doors remained closed, sealed by shadows that writhed like living things, moving subtly, deliberately, as if the building itself breathed around them. The air carried the faint hum of old chants, echoes of the voices trapped within its walls, layered over centuries of sorrow and intent. Inside, the investigator's equipment lay scattered. The audio recorder blinked faintly, its red light casting a small, unsteady glow over the altar and the crucifix that still wept, droplets falling silently into the shadows. The EMF detector remained frozen at its highest reading, lights strobing intermittently as if still capturing the unseen presence that dominated the church. The whispers had returned, low and deliberate, threading through every crevice, every corner, every inch of stone and wood. Stay witness, forever. Do not leave. They were no longer voices of the past alone. They were the collective will of the church, the culmination of every shadow, every sorrow, every figure that had been drawn to this place and never left. Outside, the night was still. The moonlight glimmered faintly across the spire, yet no wind stirred, no sound of life intruded upon the abandoned grounds. To any passerby, the church remained a hollow shell, unremarkable and silent. Yet inside, the building pulsed with life, aware, patient, sentient, and eternal. The final recording, found years later by those brave or foolish enough to enter, captured only fragments. Low hums, distant whispers, the soft drip of the crucifix, and a single repeated word, "Stay." No trace of the investigator was ever found. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no evidence of escape. The church remained, timeless and patient, doors locked by shadows, walls echoing with endless voices, waiting for the next witness, the next trespasser to be drawn into its depths. Every floorboard, every shard of broken glass, every shadowed corner held memory, intent, and the promise of inevitability. The crucifix still wept, the candles flickered without wind, and the whispers continued, a choir of the unseen, guiding, watching, claiming. The building itself had become a prison, a labyrinth of echoes, and a sentinel for those who dared enter its walls. And somewhere, deep within the stone and shadow, the investigator remained, part of the church now. Another whisper in the chorus, another shadow behind the pews, locked in the endless cycle of watching, waiting, and never leaving. The doors remained sealed, the church eternal, and the echoes endless.